as the recent disasters tell us, built assets are important. When we lose them, we lose so much more. So we do really need to think about them. But years ago, we didn't. It's really surprising. We have Talking Infrastructure has just published infrastructure. We can afford to buy it. Can we afford to keep it? It's a story of asset management. Asset management is all about maintaining what we have, providing resilience, moving forward. Completely different from capital development. So yes, that's our story, and it was published just last year, so very, very recently. And I'd like to tell you how we started in asset management, because I think there's lessons there for how we can go further. And I'll tell you my story of how I did it, because I know exactly when asset management started, to the hour. Not many people can say that for anything that they're doing, but it was April the 12th. Corporate planning in South Australian Water, where I was working, was listening to the ABC broadcasting from Parliament, and our minister was saying, in very severe tones, you knew exactly what he wanted, we are now going to charge irrigators the cost of the water we supply to them. Sounds unacceptable. However, I looked at that and said, he can't do that. And the others laughed at me, called me an idiot, said that he's a minister, he can do anything he likes. Well, ministers can do anything like that if they have the information for it. I said, I didn't say he wasn't allowed to do it, I just said he can't do it. He doesn't have the information, we don't have it to give him. Everybody looks at me and thinks, oh. I said, we don't have our capital costs. And when you're dealing with infrastructure, capital costs are your major cost. Recurrent costs, maintenance, operations, we knew those, well, roughly we knew those, but we had no idea of how much capital we were consuming each year. So that was about 11 o'clock in the morning. I went to lunch and I thought, if we don't know how much it costs to provide irrigation water, we don't know how much it costs to provide water services or sewer services or any of our research services. We had a lot of research services on how to find water in the arid north, all of which required assets. So we don't know any of those things. So after lunch, I went to my branch manager and said, how would you really like to know how much it's costing South Australians to get their water and sewer services? Not how much we're charging them, but how much it's really costing. Fortunately, I had a very good branch manager. And he says, yes, I'd really like to know that. And I had a twinge of doubt at this stage, because if you want to make a major change in an organisation, you come across all internal political problems. I had been with the organisation about 15 months at this time. I knew these things existed, I just didn't know how to deal with them. So I said to him, look, think about it overnight and let me know tomorrow morning. Well, he came back the following morning and he said, yes. So then the problem was mine. How did I find the capital costs for all the infrastructure we had in South Australia? And I should say the Water Authority had about 1/3 by value of the total infrastructure in the state. And we had no records of it. The best we had were the financial records, which were little 3 by 5 inch file cards on which people hand wrote, whenever they thought about it, whatever assets had been added in the dollars of the day. So every dollar was treated the same, 1920, 1950, 1980, it didn't matter. That's not going to work. And I was too scared to approach the finance people, because I thought that what they would do is they say, come with me, take me down into the cellar, show me dozens of dusty boxes of these little file cards and say, help yourself. I'm not. We had to find another way. So after trying all of the dollar ways of doing things, because after all I'm an economist, so that's what I look at, I realised I couldn't do it that way. I had to start with what really counted, with the actual assets themselves. So I went to our internal auditor and said, what do we have? The beautiful thing about being an economist in an engineering association is that you're free to ask all the idiot questions. Nobody expects you to know anything, and I took full advantage of asking idiot questions. And it turned out to be exceedingly valuable. And the more I talked with the engineers, the more they got interested in the same issues that I was interested in. So I had to piece together information from the heads of the practitioners. Fortunately, we were lucky at that time because just about everybody had been there for at least 20 years. Man and boy, I mean, they knew their assets. I'm sure they even had names for every single bit of it. They were personal friends. That's how well they knew them. So I just went up, sat down next to them, and they talked about their assets. They told me what problems they were facing, when they got them, when they thought they were likely to renew them, and all the typical difficulties that they faced. And I think they were pleased to have somebody to listen to them about all these things. So that was the other good thing. I did this with the heads of all of the different asset groups, and then I put the information together so that for the first time the CEO could see the big picture. Previously, every individual silo knew a lot about their work. And the way that budget meetings went were this. One guy would say, I'll vote for your project if you vote for mine. You know, typical cabinet. I think of it as the federal government cabinet model. So the guy who had the most friends was the one who got all the money. Not exactly good for the asset portfolio. So as a result of actually collecting this information and putting it all together, the CEO was now able to do prioritisation on a rational basis. And that made all the difference. For the first time, we could start making thoughtful decisions rather than ones which just reflected to the guy who could shout the loudest. Well, you know the system. Well, the first question I asked was that question: how much does it cost now? The interesting thing is that when you ask questions and then you collect the information to answer them, the next thing, and there's always a next thing, is that you realise that you could now ask another question. I thought, with the information I've already got, I reckon I could tell how much it's going to cost us and when, roughly, how much we're going to have to spend to renew all of this infrastructure. Now, I have to tell you, at that time, the renewal of infrastructure was a new idea. Most people would look at infrastructure and it was concrete and it was solid and nobody expected it to wear out. But of course, like all assets, it does wear out. But because nobody really thought of it wearing out, nobody actually thought it was necessary to plan for its renewal. So what we did was quite interesting. We mapped out the future pattern of how much it was going to cost and when, to renew all of our infrastructure systems. Now, the process for doing that, just as the process for collecting all of the asset information in the first place, involved lots of talking to people. And as I talked to people, what I was finding was that they were changing their attitudes towards assets. They were now looking at assets in a different way. Instead of thinking, an asset is something that I'm responsible for and I have to mend this thing which is right in front of me, now they started to see it as part of a total portfolio. And the more they talked about it, the more they saw these things, they saw different ways of doing things. I should say, we're used to many things now. We're used to the fact that we've got asset registers. At that stage, we didn't have an asset register. At that stage, we didn't even know what we were going to regard as the unit of account to record in an asset register. And I can remember the long hours of debates we had over what would be the basic unit of account for a sewer network. Well, the engineer said, what about from one entry point to the next entry point? Oh, but the accountants didn't like that. They said, but it'll be different lengths. Yeah, it'll be different lengths, but we can measure it. And the number of hours of fighting over whether the length was the most important thing. We could measure that separately for each of these. Next problem was, every time we had a break and we went in and repaired a bit, we would now have a bit that was aged, a bit that was new, and a bit that was aged. So every unit became 3 units. Every time nobody liked that. I didn't like that idea either. I fought it as much as everybody else did. In the end, we gave up. We couldn't do anything else. The interesting thing is that we take all these things for granted now. We don't think that at some stage people actually had to come to grips with it because they didn't know. The whole of the asset register. How did you design a hierarchical system so you have some bits which are sub to other bits? We take that for granted now, but it had to be decided. And when I came to look at the future, I had to design a new model. It was called the Life Cycle Asset Renewal Model. It's probably the most important thing that I did. I did it because I needed it. And as I go around talking to councils, I find them doing lots of really interesting work. And when I say, hey, that's really good, they look at me rather blankly and said, well, I did it because I had to. And isn't that what we always do? We do the things that we need to get done. If it hasn't already been done, we do it. I want to say that not only did we change the way we looked at things, we started regarding renewal, for example, as part and parcel of the game. And then we started saying, well, okay, do we really need to carry on doing what we've always done, which is like for like renewal? Do we really need to replace something which was built in the 1930s for their needs? Do we really need to replace it the same way now? I don't know, the obvious answer was probably not. So we started to question things which we hadn't questioned before. I want to say that at that time there was no such thing as a full-time asset manager. All of this work for the first 10 years was done by people who had a full daytime job and would do this off the side of the desk. It was a hobby. It meant that all of asset management was developed by enthusiasts. And there's nothing better than a system developed by enthusiasts. And they didn't all have to be from one council. What we found is that people working in one council would get together with 2 or 3 other local councils, and they'd all gather together and come up with joint decisions. 10 years later, when Canada took up asset management, same thing happened there. And I walked into a group of local council asset managers. The place was humming with activity. It was a little fun place to be. And I thought to myself, we used to be like that. And I said, you're a happy mob. And all the noise stopped. Complete and utter silence. I thought, Christ, what have I said? And I realised it was the word mob. So then I had to explain to them that in Australia, the Aboriginal referred to people who thought in like ways and had the same attitudes and problems as our mob. And I still think that that is a good description of asset managers. And it would be a good description of your Planetary Health asset managers as you go forward. It'll be enthusiasts that take you there. And think of us all as a mob is not a bad way of doing it. About 8 years ago, when we had now about 30 odd years of experience in this, Jeff and I were sitting down together in his rather lovely black back garden, talking about the patterns that we had gone through, the various different stages we'd gone through. I think we have a slide for that, don't we?
We do. There we are.
If I have a button. Thank you, Ruth.
Yes, you know where the slides are.
Oh, brilliant, you've already done it. Yes. As I say, about 8 years ago, we started thinking about the various different stages we had gone through. We started off with the first stage, which is when we first realised that we needed to know what we had. We were looking back. We were looking back at all the things that we had acquired and trying to figure out how much does it cost? Where is it? That was the first question. Where is it? Very difficult question, that one. And what condition is it in? When we need to renew it? What problems are we having with it? A whole heap of basic questions that needed to be asked about the assets that we already had. So now when we look back at that, we call these things waves. We call it asset inventory. It's the time we had to take an inventory of what we had. You can't start managing anything unless you know what you've got. Once you've got a fair bit of information, however, you can move up to wave 2. You can start using that information to make better decisions on your portfolio. Now you're looking at the present. You're looking at how can we take what we've got and make better use of it. The next stage, obviously, is looking forward. I call that infrastructure decision making. Now, when you look at asset managers, most of them are in wave 2. They're still taking the information that we've got. Some of us are still building up our asset inventories, but applying it to making better use of our current assets. Jeff's focus was on looking at the future. How are we going to design assets which are fit for the future? So that was the whole purpose of infrastructure decision making. And in fact, in 2016, Jeff and I and a number of other like-minded individuals set up Talking Infrastructure just so that we could help people move from wave 2 into wave 3. Because it's rather difficult to take the way in which you're managing your existing assets and say, well, what's the essence of all of that I really need to apply? What am I doing wrong? How much of what I am currently doing is because the assets I've got are the wrong assets? That was my favourite question. Because a lot of what we do is making the best use of assets that we shouldn't have had in the first place. Wave 4, we can talk about that in discussion. That is even more fascinating. But what you'll see from the diagram, which is Bruce realised that each one was embedded in the next. So we start off with the asset inventory. That becomes part of strategic asset management. That becomes part of the infrastructure decision making. And we have a whole world of future to move into. The interesting thing is it's not linear. I talked about wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. It's not linear. When we get into wave 2, we start using the data we've collected. We realise we didn't really collect the right data. And so we have to go back and improve our data collection. The same thing, when we start doing infrastructure decision making and using what we've learned about how to manage assets, we start thinking, oh, are we really doing the right thing? So it is recursive. That's why I call it waves, because waves roll over each other. Initially, we used the term the third asset management revolution because everybody was talking about the third industrial revolution, so it sounded rather sexy at the time, so we did that. But revolutions cancel out what went before. The waves don't cancel out, they build upon. And I think that is the most important thing here. So, let me see. Sorry, I lose my thread sometimes. It's getting old that does it.
Do you want to go to the previous slide?
No.
No. What we achieved.
Is it the previous slide?
It is, yes.
Okay. Can you do that? that was not the right button.
That's okay. It's your left, there we are, yes.
Yeah. look at the most significant things of what we did, because this is what we're going to have to do all over again now that we're facing the environmental challenges we're facing for the next 40 years. The first thing is that we realised that there was a missing piece of the puzzle. Then it was capital costs, and we had to fill that. Then we changed the way we looked at the problem. Instead of thinking of maintenance, we started thinking of asset management. We started, why were we maintaining? The best thing, I think, is that we provided a compelling narrative that influenced Parliament, government, and then, of course, all board levels. Once you convince Parliament, government falls into line. and once you've got government in, you've got all the agencies willing to take up and at least pay lip service to what you're doing. We provided tools like the life cycle asset renewal model, asset registers and asset management plans. This may sound silly, but we gave ourselves a name. So when people were talking about what we're doing, we could say that's asset management. I have since been told that that's the wrong name. We're stuck with it now. You might like to think seriously about what name that you're going to operate under when you make all your improvements. So this is our challenge. We had a challenge back 40 years ago. It's not the same challenge as we're facing now. We wouldn't expect it to be, would we? I think the challenge we're facing now is very difficult and complex. But I guess when you look back 40 years ago and we had nothing, that might have been difficult too. It didn't seem so difficult now, looking at what we're facing now. That seemed a very, very simple problem. But then we had nothing. We were working from ground zero. Now at least you have 40 years of experienced practitioners who now need to modify. We can't take what we've got. We can't take the data we had. We can't take the practices that we have. We can't take the general information and attitudes that we currently have for granted. Each of those has to be reconsidered in the light of what's coming next. So, I think what questions that we have for now are, what's the key information that we're missing? Once we do that, we have to fill the gap, of course. You can't just ask questions, you have to be prepared to answer them. We have to develop the tools and the new information base to do the job. And the hardest question of all, but I think, Rosemary, you're probably already halfway there, in fact, probably 3/4 of the way there. You need to develop a narrative. But the narrative has to convince those above, those at the side, those down below. It has to convince everybody. It has to convince the majority of people that your plan is in their interests. To us, of course, the plan always seems as if it's in everybody's interests. And until you go out selling it to the people, and then you realise that they see things differently. So that basically is what we now need to do. 3 things, not difficult, but easy. Have it done by tomorrow. I just wanted to put to you where we have been, and the rest of our team will take the story forward to looking at how we use this information, and particularly not the information, but the techniques that we use to get the information, which are all in the asset management story that I've written. So I'm not saying to you, buy a copy and read it, but I am saying read it.